If you are joining us this morning, please settle in. If your plans unfortunately take you elsewhere, please move your discussions away from the back of the sanctuary. Thank you, Michael. While we settle in this short intermission, this morning's service reminded me of a joke, courtesy of the late, great Tommy Smothers. In one of their shows, Dick and Tommy had this dialogue. Tommy says, "You can tell who's running the country by how much clothes people wear, see?" And Dick says, "Do you mean that some people can afford more clothes on and some people have less on? Is that what you mean?" "That's right. I don't understand. See, the ordinary people, you'd say that the ordinary people are the less-ons. So who's running the country? The morons." Thank you, Tommy. We miss you. This morning, we are privileged to hear from someone who has been a part of our community for the last year and a half or so. I distinctly remember the first day they came to church, the family was walking through and Don Ludwig snared them and said, "You have a youth, we're going to Puerto Rico in a few weeks, would you like to go?" And Norman looked at his parents and said, "Sure." So I got to go know Norman in Puerto Rico, and it's been fun having them around. And then eventually we learned just what an illustrious academic we had among us when his book was published last year, and it got a lot of buzz in the press. So Oxford University Press. That's for those who are in the habit of publishing books. That's pretty big stuff. So I don't know a lot of background, so I'm not going to try a formal introduction. Eka is a professor of New Testament at Portland Seminary, and I know he was not born in this country, and that plays into his story in his book and what he's going to talk about this morning, and so I'll let him explain all of that as he goes.
Yeah, it's been really a privilege to be part of this church, and we've been looking for a local church to be, participating and be part of local church. I don't like bigger church because you're going to be just one in many, like you're going to be swallowed under a big number. So this church is a good size, but we want to grow this church as well, but it's a good size for us, so we really enjoy to be part of this church. So I'm asked to present my book. So this is pretty pricey. That's the fate of academic work. So it's about $90, but you don't have to pay for that. But if you wanna read, you can borrow my book, my copy if you want. But I'm gonna use like about half an hour or so to present, like to give you a bigger picture of what this book is about. And then if you have any question, we can open for question and answer after my quick presentation. So this book comes out of my dissertation project at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. So this is Dr. Emily Towns. She used to teach at Yale, and then she moved to Vanderbilt to be the dean. So she was the dean when I was finishing my PhD. And this is the book. So let me see. So let me start with this statement from a French Algerian. He's not really Algerian, but he's actually from Caribbean islands, Frantz Fanon. How many of you have heard that name, Frantz Fanon? So Fanon is a very important thinker, particularly during the war between French and Algerian, French-Algerian War, War of Independence. So he has a book called Black Skin's White Mask. Very important book, meaning to say for him, the colonized often want to be like the colonizer. And the first chapter of the book is only about language, how people in Caribbean wants to speak They want to speak French because by speaking the language of the colonizer, they feel that they can be occupying the position of power of the colonizers. So different chapters. So there's one chapter about like marriage, how black man wants to marry a white woman, for instance, as part of the longing of a black person to be white. So that's why it's called Black Skin's White Mask. Very important book, particularly in post-colonial studies. So this is what he said in his book, Black Skin White Mask. To speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. So for him, language is not just about the expression of your thoughts and your idea. Language is about a culture. Language is about a world. So when you cross the linguistic borders, you're not just crossing different words, but you're actually crossing not different words or expression, you're crossing different world, different culture. How many of you have learned other language besides English? 1, 2. Many of you, yeah. How long does it take you to learn a new language to be fluent in that language? 3, 4 years, yes. How many of you are fluent in other language other than English? How many years did it take you?
I lived in Mexico.
So you live in Mexico, so years and years and years living in Mexico. Speak Spanish, yeah. So if you think about it, language is the thickest barrier among people. It's easy for you to wear Chinese clothes or eat Chinese food, easy. To speak Chinese is a whole different story, right? It's easy for you to speak, to wear Indonesian clothes, but to speak Indonesian language is a completely different story, right? So language is the thickest barrier among people. And that's why language oftentimes becomes the marker of in-group and out-group. Who becomes the insiders and who becomes the outsiders. I'll talk more about it later. But let me ground this with the American context. The US, this is from Stephen May's article called Language and Minority Rights, Ethnicity, Nationalism, and the Politics of Language. This is what he said. The USA is not and never has been a monolingual country. Indeed, multilingualism has been a feature of US society since the colonial times of the 18th century. A feature which should not surprise us given the US much vaunted status as the largest immigrant country of them all. In American colonies between 1715 and 1850, non-speaking English Europeans settlers made up 1/4 of the white population, and Dutch, New York, Swedish, Delaware, and German, Pennsylvania were widely spoken. At one point, Benjamin Franklin was really upset at people in Pennsylvania because they refused to speak English. Their signs are in German. And he wrote a letter to his friend in England, and he said that these people are not white enough for refusing to speak English. Native Americans and their languages were also enormous. And black Americans, mostly slave, with their many languages, number more than 1/5 of the total population. So historically speaking, America is a really multilingual space. Then the biggest question for us is why English becomes the dominant language, right? So that's the question that I am exploring in this book. Now, this is a modern question. The question of the politics of language. When people get together and they speak different languages, whose language becomes the dominant language or becomes the operating language in that space? That is the essence of the politics of language. Whose language gets silenced? In social linguistics, sometimes people debate whether you can call language death is a language death or language murder. Those are two different things. Because language death, meaning to say that whether language undergoes, or a language undergoes a natural death, meaning to say that the community of speakers decide to give up their language, or the linguistic shift, or linguistic, it happens all the same. Linguistic language shift and language death almost happens at the same time. When you see the shift of language or in one community, is it because that community voluntarily give up their language, or because of there is a powerful force from outside that kills that language? So this debate often happens particularly in the conversation about Native American languages. Why do these languages somehow disappear? Right? People like James Crawford and others, sociolinguists, would argue that maybe we shouldn't call it language death. Probably we should call it language murder. Right? Especially if your kids are taken out from your community, put in the boarding schools, taught them English. It's a very systemic effort, often in the name of the church. Many of these are missionaries too, right? Taught them English. When they come back to the community, the whole generation already don't speak the language. And when the older generation died out, what happened? Language death or language is almost inevitable, right? So this is the essence of the politics of language. So okay, I want to. Oh my goodness, time. Let me play this real quick.
But I don't want to hear your language. If they want to sit and be quiet, that'd be great.
If you don't want to hear it, they're welcome to be here. They're doing nothing wrong. You're the one that's causing an issue.
Excuse me.
Go back
Excuse me.
Excuse me?
Especially on Oriental. I hate it.
I'm sorry, but they're allowed to speak their language.
Like President Obama said, that everyone in here in America and enjoying America should speak English.
I'm sorry, but they're completely allowed to use their own language. Feel free to please leave.
I don't want to hear the language.
We do want to hear.
Then you better go off from here.
You can sit and be quiet, fine.
This is not the first time
But
that you've
I don't want to hear your
language.
language. I don't want to hear it.
We have a freedom to use my own language.
I'm asking you to please leave.
If they want to sit and be quiet, that'd be great.
If you don't-
Get this letter out.
You're pressing numbers over and over again.
Okay, now I'm asking you to leave. If you don't want to leave, I'm going to public place.
Can you move to the next video?
That's up to you.
That's fine.
This happens in San Francisco. And then this is a debate during the 2016 election. Remember that debate when Jeb Bush spoke Spanish in Florida, remember? And it becomes a discussion.
You have
in the debate.
criticized Governor Bush for speaking Spanish on the campaign trail. You said, quote, he should really set an example by speaking English in the United States. What's wrong with speaking
Well,
Spanish?
I think it's wonderful and all, but I did it a little bit half-heartedly, but I do mean it to a large extent. We have a country where to assimilate, you have to speak English. And I think that where he was and the way it came out didn't sound right to me. We have to have assimilation. To have a country, we have to have assimilation. I'm not the first one to say this, Dana. We've had many people over the years, for many, many years, saying the same thing. This is a country where we speak English, not Spanish.
Well, I've been speaking English here tonight, and I'll keep speaking English, but the simple fact is if a high school kid asked me a question in Spanish, a school, by the way, a voucher program that was created under my watch, the largest voucher program in the country, where kids can go to a Christian school, and they ask me a question in Spanish, I'm going to show respect and answer that question in Spanish, even though they do speak English and even though they embrace American values.
This was a reporter, not a high school kid, by the way.
Dana, I agree that English is the unifying language of our country, and everyone should learn to speak it. It's important.
Okay, let me stop there. The idea that English is a unifying language has never been part of the US Constitution at all. Let me read part of this, of the book so you can have some ideas of what I'm working on. The US Constitution does not designate English as the official language. Although the House Representatives passed the, quote, the English Empowerment Act on August 1st, 1996, the bill failed in Senate. A similar attempt to constitute English as an official language of the United States reoccurred under, quote, the English Unity Act, end of quote, bill and introduced in 2005. Yet none of these bills have become law of the law of the land, and no one could say that English has never, and no one could say that English has never been, and one could say that English has never been the official language of the United States. So the idea that we have English, but English is not an official language in the United States because of, if you establish the English as the official language, then you violate the First Amendment, freedom of speech, right? So it never passed Senate or Congress. But here's the thing. Instead, the dominance of contemporary English must find its root in the long history of America as a former British colony. The reputation of English as, quote, an international language cannot be separated from its connection to the historical expansion of the British imperial power. As Najabulo Nembele correctly puts it, quote, the very concept of an international or world language was an invention of Western imperialism, end of quote. Therefore, although on the surface America may appear to be a multicultural society and the land of immigrants, people here are still subjected to the dominance of the imperial language. The idea of becoming American is both politically and socially tied to the ability to speak English. That's why when you want to be naturalized, one of the requirements of the naturalization is what? You have to pass the English test. So language becomes the marker of whether you're American or non-American. The propaganda of, quote, melting pot society simply means that one needs to subject oneself to the dominant culture rooted in the hegemony of English. As an immigrant whose native language is not English, echoing Frantz Fanon again, sentiment that to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture, I see English not only as a means of communication, but also as a political apparatus imposed on others by the dominant culture. So, the rise of the official, this is a statement from John Horton and Jose Calderon, the rise of the official English movement in the United States could well signal a growing nativism and anti-immigrant backlash. Like the nativist movements of the late 19th and early 20th century, the campaign for official English coincides historically with a period of massive immigration. By the way, the requirement of English in the naturalization process did not pass until early 20th century. Why? Because you have an influx of immigration in the 19th century. Right? So what you see here is that when immigration takes place, when people migrate from these different places, language encounter, the language difference, the encounter of the language difference is almost inevitable. Because it's almost inevitable, then the politics of it becomes completely inevitable. Does that make sense? Okay. So, okay. Because of this, I tried to look into the ancient world, particularly in the first century, and see whether early Christians, because my field is in the New Testament studies, so I'm looking at how the early Christians, do early Christians struggle with this or not? If language is a universal human phenomenon, and language differences existed long before American history, right? Did they struggle with the same issue or not? If they did, how did they do it? How did they talk about it? So this is the background in which I approach the New Testament text. Immigration, issue of politics of language, issue of language, social linguistics, and so on. So this is a map drawn by a Cambridge classicist, and also he's a philologist, James Clarkson, in his book called Language and Society in Greek and Roman World. If you can see here, this world is very multilingual, the Mediterranean world. You have West Semitic, we have Phrygian language, you have all kinds of languages here. This is the map of the 5th century BCE, before Common Era. 4th century CE, in the Common Era, you can see the map in a really different way. The western part of the Mediterranean world was dominated mainly by Latin, right? And the eastern part was dominated mainly by Greek. This is 4th century CE. 1st century CE is often called Greco-Roman world. Why is it called Greco-Roman world? Because the Roman ruled the eastern part of the Mediterranean world, but the language on the ground was Greek. That's why it's called Greco-Roman, the rule of Romans, but then the language on that's why the New Testament was written in Greek. Right? But this is what he said about this phenomenon. There are clear ancient analogies of the modern processes of colonialism in the expansion of Greek and Latin around the shores of the Mediterranean from the Hellenistic period through the late antiquity. As in the colonial case, in many areas of the ancient world, local languages coexisted alongside Greek. Right? This is what you often see. When you see the phenomenon of bilingualism, it tends to be the coexistence of the local language and the imperial language. Often. If you go to Philippines, people in the Philippines would speak, they call it Tagalog. So it's the combination, it's the coexistence of what? Tagalog and English. Right? Alongside the dominant languages of the army and the imperial officials and merchants. So, let me go back here. So when early Christians began to expand from this area, from Jerusalem, from Judea here, all the way, you see the story in the book of Acts is the story of the movement from Judea, from Jerusalem, all the way, the book of Acts ends when Paul was in Rome. So when they cross this area, they cannot avoid the multilinguality of this world. Right? When they cross. So when I was reading the New Testament, I was like, what is it in the New Testament that shows that these early Christians struggle with this multilingualism, struggle with these linguistic differences around them? Where is it? Right? And I found like there is a phrase that's often translated as speaking in tongues. Appears in the New Testament. It appears in 1 Corinthians 14. It starts from 1 Corinthians 12, actually, 12, 13, 14. Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 10, and Acts chapter 19. And also you have, this is what scholars often call the longer ending of Mark. The longer ending of Mark, if you know the Gospel of Mark, the earlier version of the Gospel of Mark, right, only have the women are afraid. That's it. But then some other scribes would think like, oh my goodness, the end is very open. They're just afraid. So they added the story that they met Jesus and so on, and Jesus said that you will hold snakes and things like that, and speak in tongues. That's the longer ending. So if you read your Bible, it's often put in the parentheses, the longer ending. It came later. All right. Now, speaking in tongues, why I'm interested in this phenomenon, because the word glossa in Greek is widely used in Greek literature as language. Remember, Greek doesn't have a word for language, right? Like in modern linguistics, people often distinguish, this is based actually on the work of a linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure argues that you can distinguish language as the speech and the langue. In French is langue and parole. Parole is the speech. And for him, if you want to study language, you don't study parole. Why? Parole is so different, right? Even among English-speaking people, right? You have different accent, different ways of expressing things. Parole is messy. But what you need to study language, you have to study language at the level of langue, system. So he calls it the system of signs. Greek doesn't have that. The system for him, the system of sign is, in a really big term, is a synchronic system, whereas parole tend to be more diachronic. So for him, you have to study language at this level, the level of the system of language, like grammar, for instance. How do people establish grammar? English, like, you have subject, and then if it is third person singular, you have verb, and you have to have s and es. How do they establish this rule? Do you know how people grammarians establish grammar? Do you know how do they do it? They look at how language is used on the ground. So it's not the other way. People, when you speak English, you don't think about grammar. Right? Do you think about grammar? Like, no. I've taught Greek for many, many years. And many English-speaking people don't know grammar. They don't know what participle is. They don't, because they don't think about grammar. Right? They don't know what gerund is. Right? Do you know what gerund is? Yes. Why? Because when you speak language, you don't even think about it. It's the grammarians who think about it. Right? They observe you and they say, oh, this is the rule of language. Now, when somebody violates the rule, they say, no, this is a wrong language. No. Language moves all the time. And not only language moves all the time, community would have different linguistic habits as well. Right? If you go to African America, they have really different linguistic habits than white community or Hispanic community, Asian community, very different because of the layers of social experiences and so on. So it's very tricky relationship between langue and parole. You see that? Greek doesn't have that. So for them, language is a bodily expression, it's bodily movement, right? Tongue. So they use it. So, in Greek, for instance, if you find somebody in Greek literature, if you find if Josephus, for instance, say that, he speaks Hebrew language, sometimes they add Hebrew and tongue, the word glossa, after the word Hebrew. Often like that. So for them, it's not the system of sign, it's this modern invention of language. It's the bodily expression. It's a bodily movement. Right? That's why to silence language is to silence one's bodily expression. Glossa. Now, you still have that in English until today, right? Tongue. What do you say if somebody's first language? What do you call it? Somebody's first language? Mother tongue. Right? You still have that in English, right? Native tongue or mother tongue. You still have it. We don't often use it, but it's still there in English. That the word tongue means language, and it's everywhere. So I say, like, this is a side of analysis. This is an interesting side of some analysis to see how the early Christian wrestled with the issue of multilingualism. Because this is very relevant not only to them, but super relevant to us here as well. Right? Martin Luther King Jr. said what? The 11th hour on Sunday morning is the most what? Segregated hours in the United States. He's speaking in terms of racial segregation. But if you see churches in America, it's mainly language too now. The Hispanics worship on the other side, the Urdu worship, Tagalog worship in different sides. 11th hour is still the most segregated space in the US. So, this is what Aristotle, in his very fascinating book on the soul, it's called On the Soul, De Anima in Latin. This is what he said. Nature uses tongue, the tongue, te glotte, here if you see, the word glossa, same, both for the taste, which is the physical tongue, right, and for articulation, for language, of which taste is essential for life, and articulate speech is an aid to living well. So even for Aristotle, tongue, the word tongue has double function. Tongue is for taste, the physical tongue, but also tongue is also for language. All right. Let me see here the map of the first century Roman map. If you see here, this is the city of Corinth. I need to stop in like 5 minutes. So the city of Corinth is right in the middle of the Mediterranean world. There are actually two ports that connect the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Eastern part of the Mediterranean. What happened with me? So it connects eastern part and it connects the western part of the Mediterranean world. That's why Corinth is a place that is filled with immigrants. People move and come to Corinth all the time. So then you see the First Corinthians. This is what Donald Engels in his book, Roman Corinth, he said, Roman Corinth received immigrants from not only from one or two regions, but from all over the Mediterranean world. Okay, I want to go straight to the Bible now. It's like a long way to go to the Bible, right? This is what Paul said. So imagine, this is, when I reconstruct the history of Roman Corinth, I argue that Roman Corinth is a multilingual space. So when people begin to follow Jesus and believe in this message of this guy from Palestine named Jesus, when they get together, they would somehow speak their language. I can really understand this because if I see an Indonesian right there and I go there to meet the Indonesian, I will not speak English. I will switch my language immediately. So when they speak and when they begin to pray, when they begin to worship, they do it in their own language. Paul was like, what the heck is going on here? Right? And this is what Paul said. For those who speak in a tongue, in a language, and I argue that Paul is talking about foreign language. For those who speak in a foreign language, they do not speak to other people but to God. For nobody understands them. So Paul said, no, don't speak other languages. Because nobody understands you. Now in Greek, it actually means nobody, the word akuo here means nobody hears. So Paul is concerned with people, concerned with those who hears, not because that language is ununderstandable, but because the hearers don't understand. Now, this is deeply embedded in the way the Greeks sing the others. What are the others of the Greeks? Barbarians. You know what is barbarians? Barbarians is blah, blah, blah. It's like, I don't understand your language, you're barbarian. Not because that language is not understandable, because the Greeks don't understand. So it becomes gibberish, right? Paul takes this and says, like, no, stop. This is the next one. Therefore, no one speaks one who speaks in tongues should pray for the power of interpretation. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unproductive. So for him, he demands the foreign language speakers in Corinth to translate the language. So you can see here, what I see in Paul is really parallel to the English-speaking movement. English-only movement in the United States. You could say that, probably. And also, this is the other one. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be one or two or more, at most three, and each in turn, let one interpret. Diermeneo. Here, this is the word in Greek. It's if you know in Greek, the word dia, when the word dia is connected to a verb, it means thoroughly. It has to be done thoroughly. So it has to be translated thoroughly for Paul. But if there is no one interpret, or in Greek it should be if there is no translation. This is a noun actually. If there is no translation, let them be silent in the church and speak to themselves and to God. So you can imagine my feeling when I was reading this. There is a force of silencing. There's a force of pushing linguistic differences aside for the sake of unification of language in that space. Okay, quickly. This is what I said in the book. Paul is not only making a theological statement here, but also a political one. Can you see that? The church is a political structure. Thus, as in any other social structure such as empire, nation state, city-state, and so on, the unification of speech or language is an absolute requirement for its survival and expansion. To this end of promoting a monolingual ecclesial order, Paul proposes two interconnected arguments. No one understands, and they speak mystery. Now, this is the fun part. It seems like somebody is not happy with Paul in the first century. Luke constructed another story in the book of Luke. Remember, the book of Acts came later. So 1 Corinthians is often considered the earliest book in the New Testament. Acts is often considered the latest. And then if you see the story of Pentecost, are you familiar with that? Acts chapter 2. The opening of space for multilingualism. And they can somehow understand each other. Luke uses exactly the same phraseology, phrase. Speak in tongues. By the way, this phrase cannot be found in any other Greek literature except for Pauline letters. So when Luke picked it up, that must be really intentional. So my argument is that when Luke saw Paul's behavior in Corinthians, Paul said, no, we need to create another Christian imagination that is embedded in the story of Pentecost. The opening of space for the proliferation of linguistic differences. That translation is no longer required, but people are empowered by the Spirit to speak other languages. To me, that is a powerful social imagination of how to live in a multilingual space. It's not that you force me to speak your language, but can I speak your language? Can you see that? So I'll stop there, and then I'll open for question and answer. Anybody?
Okay, here we go. You got it? Okay. Who has a question for the good doctor?
I don't particularly, is this on?
Yeah.
I don't particularly have a question, but my own experience. My parents immigrated from Norway. I was born in this country. My brother, who is 5.5 years older than I, was raised in the Norwegian language. When he went to school, he could not speak English. When I was born 5.5 years later, I was not allowed to speak the language. It was spoken in our home. They had many, many friends who spoke the language. I learned to understand quite a bit of it, but I was never allowed to speak it. So that's kind of the incorporation of having to be English. Now we observe the traditions, but the language was forbidden.
Yeah. Like many Germans, especially after World War II, there's a anti-German climate in the United States. Many people who speak German are being banned from, speaking the language in schools.
Actually, I had the same experience. I had, my parents decided we were going to speak English in our home, and so from probably around, well, let's just say we were bilingual. My mother was bilingual, but my father was from Mexico, and he had already told us that we were going to be speaking English, and he studied and went to school and went to high school, and he was an immigrant, and it was just amazing. I can't even fathom it now, but he had books around, and he was probably, you're going to college, told me, Susan, you're going to college. He had it all set up. But the point I'm thinking about right now is that I had a friend who went to school. At kinder, I was ready, reading ready, and it turns out I had the ability, so I'm thankful for that. But my friend, a family friend, she couldn't pick up the language, the sounds, the hearing, all of that. It's a very layered story, but she ended up going to special ed because they couldn't understand her, and she couldn't understand the language, not necessarily the language, but she couldn't learn. She was a different learner. So it's amazing that people have language, in my opinion, but there's a lot more to the story. But that's a significant point of, I'm in education myself, so I know that's pretty difficult.
Yeah, this is the criticism of like standardized tests too. Yes. Right? Like in SAT, ACT, GRE, right? And many of these tests, remember, one of the standardized tests is linguistic ability, right? You have to have a higher, but many of these, have you memorized like GRE words? Have you memorized those words? Many of them are actually rooted in Latin words and Greek words. So now, people of color and have a hard time achieving and doing well in those tests because that's not part of the tradition.
So I'll switch gears a little. How much of this is specific to Corinth? Because as you point out in your book, Corinth had been wiped out by the Romans 100 years earlier.
Completely, yeah.
Like many cities in Greece had. Repopulated with slaves. It was such a valuable place because you could take by mule loads off ships from one side of the ocean to the other in only 6 miles. So the Romans allowed it to be repopulated with, I think, 85 or 90% of the population was slaves from all over.
Former slave,
yeah,
free people.
Yeah, so how much of this was specific to Corinth? Paul doesn't talk about this in any of his other epistles, where cities where, you'd have typically just one other language.
Yeah.
That's a question. And then does any of it have anything to do with the fact that, Paul has this charter to be sent to the Gentiles while, James and Peter to the Jews?
That's his claim, right? That's his claim.
Is Paul trying to maintain control?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I'm writing a book on 1 Corinthians now. And if you read 1 Corinthians, if you read carefully, one of the people say that the devil's in the details. Is that right? So when you read carefully, chapter 1, for instance, Paul said that, I heard from Chloe's, right, the Chloe's people, that there is division among you. And he said that some of you said that I'm of Paul, of Apollos, of Cephas or Peter, and of Christ. Read the next part. The next part, he doesn't talk about those people anymore. He talks about himself. So maybe, okay, here's the thing. Maybe, this is my reconstruction of the story. The debate is not division among the Corinthians themselves, but maybe the controversy in Corinth is actually controversy between them and Paul. They don't want to hear Paul, they want to hear other people. And Paul was like, no. If you read chapter 3, Paul said, I'm your mother. Chapter 4, Paul said, I'm your father. So he established himself as an authority. And chapter 5, this is the violent part of 1 Corinthians chapter 5. When he said that, I heard that there is a Greek word for it, porneia. There is a immorality, sexual immorality. It's a really tricky word to translate in Greek. Among you, remember, he heard. So he didn't have direct access to the case. But read chapter 5, chapter 6, you will find that he demands that person to be killed. He said, hand that person to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. Many commentators, Hans Konzelmann, a German commentator, say you cannot read this another way, but Paul is demanding this person to be killed. So there's this political tension right there in 1 Corinthians.
I see the title of your discussion is The Politics of Language. I know that many people know Greta Roll here, and when Greta and Peter came, they spoke Dutch, and when they came to the United States, their 5-year-old son was indeed put in special education because he didn't speak English. And I completed over 30 years working as an English as a second language teacher in the public schools. And it was fascinating to me to see children who would be able to speak English really as if they were native speakers. And then their parent would come for parent conferences and they were able to go right into, say, Vietnamese or something and speak perfectly. And one of my children fascinated me so much because she had no accent whatsoever. And I thought, oh, she probably doesn't even speak her native language in there. In fact, it was there. And it was many, many, many different languages. But the way teachers sometimes categorize kids who didn't speak English well that was where my intervention came. And I was able to tell them all that they could do and then take some of the difficult academic language that was presented to these kids and try to explain to them how that was very difficult for them to understand it at their age. This was elementary age. But it was such a pleasure to work with these kids, just the best, and their parents, to make their parents feel safe when they came to school. I loved my job.
Yeah, well, typically if you grow up in two languages at the same time, to be perfectly bilingual is easy. But if you grow up in one linguistic background, only one, like after a certain age, if I'm mistaken, 12, 13? And when the language has already established, it's so hard to be perfectly bilingual. You can speak, but you will never be able to speak like with, perfect accent, like, So if you hear people who speak with an accent, it means that there is another language that's already established underneath that language.
I have a question on Zoom back here.
Yeah.
From Scott Norwood. He says, in your eye, are there any ways to address the SAT GRE testing system to still test aptitude without the bias of the Latin and Greek roots in the language? And, other language bias. I think that's a good question because that's quite a
great question. And I feel like in America, this is related also to the debate on affirmative action. Affirmative action. That if you modify it, people think like you are compromising the quality of education. You see that? You make the education cheaper, easier. Right? That's the debate. I just want to put it on the table. Now this is my position at this point. I like what some universities are doing now. They don't put it as a requirement anymore. ETS makes a ton of money. You know what ETS is? ETS is the organization that, ETS makes a lot of money out of this. I took GRE 3 times, and my score is still not good. So I think it should be optional. Go ahead.
So would you not say, and my question then falls, is it your book? So how much linkage do you have to how language is tied to trade and economics?
Ooh.
Because the rationale here is,
That's a good question.
which is the whole reason why current global economic change are taking place. Many countries have taken on several languages as being their home language. Singapore, for example, has Indonesian,
Bahasa.
English, as well as Mandarin. So there are 4 languages in certain countries, but that's a new country, less than 1965. France, or not French, Canada has 2 languages, official. NATO has 2 languages. Everything is published in French and English because at one time France was trade. So my question is there a linkage between trade and otherwise, which is really the reason why many of these languages
totally,
spread. It's all about trade.
Totally.
Which I believe, and I'll candidly say, I believe America should have one language, but it can have other languages with it because there has to be a language of trade and commonality to work for. No disagreement in having one, but what's wrong with having root languages that take other languages on and move forward? Because if I say, you totally slay me, that you're just the bomb, you're the best, but that's a new language that we're taking on and moving forward with. But
Speaking of that, let me give a comment really quick there. English language, particularly some expressions, tend to be very violent. I kill it. I destroy it. Knowledge, I grasp it. Bomb, it's a bomb. We love in English. We take it, we normalize it. That's why what happened in Palestine, when people get bombed and bombarded, especially the enemies, we get them. It's embedded in our language. But okay, I just want to give that really, let me give that really comment on economics really quickly. Yes. And most of the time, if you know the history of colonization didn't start, particularly Dutch colonization, didn't start as a political or military campaign. It started as an economic trade. So yes, the expansion of a colonial language happens because of the expansion of trading as well. I just want to give that comment really quick.
Aramaic and Greek at the time of the early church, did you delve into how Greek overcame Aramaic? Was there perhaps conflict between Paul and the Jerusalem church? Would one of that have been language by any chance?
Yeah, there are 2 layers of question there, Aramaic and Greek. You must be familiar with Herodotus' book called Histories. Are you familiar with that? That's the history of the fight between the Persians and the Greeks, right? And what happened is at the end of that book, Herodotus defined Greek as coming from the same lineage, but then he also defined it as the same language. And the way the Greeks expands is very different from the way the Romans expanded. The Romans, they just they put the client kings like Herod, right? Herod in the New Testament is a client king. They put a client king and they extract as much as possible tax. Greeks are different. That's why the Greek language is all over the place. What they do, when they arrive in one place, they will change the culture of that place. If you are interested in this, read 2nd Maccabee, the story of how, not Galilee, but Judea and Jerusalem gets Hellenized. It was brutal what happened in 2nd Maccabee. So again, the switch of language, right?
We're running short on time, and I'm holding the microphone, so I'm going to get my one question in. Sorry. But in studying the New Testament, it's always seemed that a really, really key question is how many people could read and write? Yeah. Because there's spoken language and then there's written language. Mm-hmm. And you've kind of talked about both. Obviously, the word tongue refers to spoken language. But then you have this whole layer of written language, which we're so used to living in a world where everybody reads and writes that we know we can put up a sign and everybody can read it, and but what percentage of folks in Paul's world could actually read and write, and how is that divide between people who could read and write and those who couldn't?
That's a whole session of.
I know, that's another class.
But this is what I was saying, that to define literacy and illiteracy is a tricky thing, right? Because it connects to the idea of if I can understand a language, if I can understand and I cannot speak, does it mean that I'm illiterate in that language or not? So that's another different dynamic, right? If I can read and I cannot write, am I literate or not in that language? Typically, scholars would say that the percentage of illiterate is really, really high. Some even put it above 75, 80%. Scribes who are able to write is a profession in the ancient world, right? It's a professional thing. You don't, because the access to papyrus, the access to, particularly not papyrus, the skin of animal skin, right? What do you call parchment, right? Parchment. The access to parchment is expensive. The 4th century Greek codex called Codex Sinaiticus. I did a calculation with a student in advanced Greek. It cost, just to produce that, it cost about $3 million. One Bible. That's why the distinction between laity and clergy is very clear. Because clergy has access to this, they have access to this. But now, when knowledge is at the tip of one's finger, can we still make that distinction between clergy and laity, right? Maybe it's true during the Martin Luther's time or before, but after the coming of the printing press, the coming of internet, oh my.
There's the clergy, yeah, right.
Yeah, this is the clergy.
So to give Luke the last word, maybe. He did not see multilinguisticness as an impediment to growth. In fact, he saw it just the opposite, right?
Who is this?
Luke. Paul. Luke who wrote Acts and the Gospel. Where was Luke located? Do we have any idea?
No, we don't. Yeah, it's all speculation to locate where Luke. But we know that Luke wrote mainly for maybe non-Jewish, because of Theophilus in the beginning of Theophilus. In Theo means God, and Philos, you have Philadelphia in the U.S., right? Friend or love. By the way, the word in Greek, philos, can mean love and friend too. So we have 2 different words in English, by the way. But we don't know. We don't know where Luke wrote from. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians probably from Ephesus, probably. So after he visited in Acts chapter 18, he visited Corinth, he went to Ephesus. Before he went to Ephesus, a guy came, his name is Apollos, right? And the name Apollos appeared also in 1 Corinthians. It seems like some scholars argue that Apollos came. Many people get interested in Apollos. And they're like, no, don't listen to that guy, Paul. And Paul gets so upset. Speaking of controlling leader, read Paul closely. Paul is my guy. I read him I have a love-hate relationship with Paul. But Scott, to answer your question, we don't know what exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's not wait till your next book comes out to do this again.
Thanks a lot.
You've got a lot to share. The undecorators need to get to work, and I think Michael has the last word on that.
Before you get up and go, thank you very much for being in attendance for the adult class, but also I'm inviting you to lunch out here in the kitchen, pass through, sandwiches, chips, hot soup, homemade, and then the cost of the soup is staying and helping with the undecorating of the sanctuary. It's an easy deal, right? Win-win? Please, if you're going to stay, you have lunch. If you're not going to stay, don't have lunch. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two different things. It's huge. Exactly. It's huge. But sometimes people throw the word illiteracy,
And it's growing. For example, when